Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be building this contact form in Next.js, and it's going to have some basic validation. So if they don't have a field filled out, the submit button will be disabled and this error state will be displayed. But once they filled everything out, they can hit submit, and that's going to go ahead and send an email. And this is what the email is going to look like. It's going to have all our fields and then the values that they input. And then we can email the customer with the email they put here. I'm also going to be using a Gmail account to send and receive emails. So if you want to follow along, you want to make sure you have a Gmail account. And without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so I have the starting files open, and these are going to be linked in the description below so you guys can follow along. And right now we just have this contact heading. So if I open up our folder, you can see in the pages directory, our index or our home page just has this heading that says contact. And then in our app.js, this is what Next.js uses to build out every page. So this component that it gets in its props represents each page component that we define in the pages directory. So we could wrap the page component with an app container, which is what I'm doing, and just setting some global styles and rendering the children. And then I'm also wrapping it with the Chakra provider to give the Chakra components access to certain styles and properties. And then also this theme just sets the default color mode to dark. So that's it for the starting files. And now we can start building out the contact form. Let's begin by wrapping our entire page with a container. And all of our content is going to go inside. So let's move our heading up. And then let's also give the container a max width so that the form doesn't extend that. So we'll do 450 pixels. And then let's also give it some margin top. We'll just do 12. So that should add a little bit of spacing. I'll get rid of the semicolon. Now we can begin working on the form inputs. And the way those are going to work is we're going to create a form control component. And inside of that form control, we're going to have a form label, an input, and a form error message. And the form control is going to help us display the error state if the input has an error. So let's go back and add all of those things. So we'll do form control, and that comes from Chakra. And then inside, we're going to want a form label. And the first label we want is the name. And then also in this form control, we want to set it to required. So we'll just set is required, and that'll just display a little asterisk at the top. And now we want to create our input. Let's create that here. And now let's set some properties on it. So we could do the type, and we want it to be the type text. And then we also want to give it a name. And we're going to use that to set our state later. So the name will just be name because that's the label here. And now if we hit save, we should be able to see that in our app. So there's our first field. Right now, this isn't being controlled by any sort of state. So let's come up here and just create some state for our form. And I'm just going to create an object up here called initState. And right now we're just going to have a values property. This property is going to store all of our form values, but our state is also going to have other properties like the loading or error states, but I will add those later. In here, I want to create another object for the specific form values. So we'll do init values, and then that will just contain all of our form values. So I'm just going to paste those in real quick. And then I'll set these values to init values. And now we can use this init state as the default state here. Okay, so now back in our input, we want the value to be set to whatever values in the state. First, I want to destructure all the form values from the state so that we don't have to access it by doing state.values every time. So we'll just do const values, and we're going to get that from the state. So now we can just use values.name. So in here, we'll do values.name. Now this input is hooked up to the state. But now you'll see that we can't update the state, and that's because there's no onChange handler defined. So let's define that real quick. We'll do const onChange, we'll do handle change. And this is going to be a function that's going to take in an event, and then we want to update our state. Let's go ahead and call setState. And in setState, we could either pass in a new object to set that state to the object, or we can use a function, and the function has a parameter that is the old state. So we could get the previous state, and then we want to return a new object, which will be our new state. And in here, we want to spread the old state So we'll just spread out previous. And that's because if we have other properties on the state object here, we want to retain those. So we'll spread those out. And then we want to override the values property. And in here, again, we want to spread out the previous values. So we'll do previous state.values, just because when we update the name, we want to retain the email and the subject and so on. So then in here, we can open up square brackets, and on the event, we have access to the input that triggered it. So we'll have access to the name property on the input and also the value of it. So in the event, I actually want to destructure the target, which will be that input. And as the property here, we want the target dot name, and then the value will be target dot value. So again, we're setting this name property here, and whatever this string value is whatever the property name will be in the state. And then we're just setting it to the input value that triggered the event. So now we can just set this as our onChange handler. And that component should now be controlled. All right, so now we can just copy and paste this for all of our other inputs. So I'm going to do that real quick. So the only input that'll be different is the message. And instead of this being an input, it's going to be a text area. But all these properties can stay the same. So now if we go back to our app, we'll see all of these, and we'll be able to type in all of them. And let's just add some margin bottom to all of them. So I'll just add MB5, and that should give all of them a little bit of margin. Okay, that looks good. Let's also give the text area some rows. And we'll set that to 4. And then for the email input, we want to make sure that it's of type email. The next thing we need to do is to show some error state in our form. We can do that by setting the isInvalid property on the form control. Let's come in here and do isInvalid, and we'll just set this to true for now, so it'll always be invalid. And in order for our input to display in an error state, we can give it the error border color, and we'll just set that to red.300. This is just going to set it to the Chakra red default colors, and then the 300 just represents the darkness of the color. So it's going to be a lighter red. And then also we can display the form error text or error message, and that'll be from Chakra. And here we'll just say required. We save this and go back to the form. You'll see that this input is displayed in the error state. Right now, it's just hard-coded to always be in an error state. So let's change that. Instead of it being true, we want it to be in the error state when there's no value. So we could do values.name, and then we want to check if this is falsy. So if values.name is false, then isInvalid will be true. And then the input will know to use the error border color. And Chakra also knows that when isInvalid is true, then it's going to display the form error message. So if we just save that, then you'll see that it's in the error state when there's no text, but then when we add some text, it'll go away. So let's just add that for the rest of the inputs. All right, now that that's added, we could see that all the fields have this validation. If we go to refresh the page, we could see that the form initially displays in this error state, and that's because we don't have any values filled in. Ideally, we'd want the form to display in its normal state, and then once the user clicks on an input and types something, and then clicks off of it, that's when we want the form input to validate itself, because initially this would not be a great user experience. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to create another piece of state, and that's going to contain all of our touched values. So we'll do touched, and then set touched. And this will be an empty object initially. Then in our input, we could come down here and check that the value was touched. So we could do touched.name, and values.name is undefined. If both of these are true, then this input will be invalid. So if we save this, we'll see that it no longer initially displays in the error state because it hasn't been touched. So we want the user to first touch the input, and then when they touch out of it, or when the input is blurred, then we want to validate it. So let's create our onBlur handler. We'll call it onBlur. It'll be a function, and again, we're going to destructure the target. And then we'll call setTouched. And here we'll get the previous state in the function, and we'll return a new object retaining that previous state. And then we want to set the property that came from the target. So we'll do target.name. And for the value, we'll just set it to true. So then in our touch state, we'll just have all of our property names, then true if it has been touched. So let's just add this onBlur handler to each input. And if we go back to our app and refresh, you'll see that they no longer display in an error state, except for the ones that aren't checking if they're touched. So we also need to add this check to verify that they've been touched. So I'll just add that to every input. Now, if we go back and refresh, we'll see that they all are validated on the blur. And then once you type, the error goes away because it has been touched and there's a value. So this is working exactly how we want it to. The last thing we need for our form is the submit button. So let's go ahead and add that. So we'll import the button, and in here we'll just do submit, and then let's give it some props. So the variant, we want it to be outline. We also want the color scheme to be blue, and that'll just add some blue styles to it. We also want the button to be disabled when any of our form values are not defined. So we want to just grab all of the values and do a check. So we're going to check if the values.name is undefined, or the email is undefined, or subject or message. And if any of these are undefined, then disabled will be true, and then it'll display the button in a disabled state and we won't be able to click on it. And then the last thing we need to add is an onClick handler, and we'll just call it onSubmit. So let's go ahead and create this onSubmit handler. It's going to be an async function. And in here, we want to set our form state to loading. So in order to do that, we'll call setState. We'll get the previous state, and again, return a new state object retaining the previous state. Except now we want to set a new property, and we'll set the isLoading property, and we'll set that to true. So now when we hit submit, isLoading will be true. And then in our button, when we click submit, we want it to display in a loading state. So we'll put the isLoading prop, and whenever this is true, the button will display in that loading state. So we'll just check state, or actually we can just destructure it from our state object up here. We want values isLoading, and now we can just use that down here. So if we come back, we'll see that the button is disabled because email isn't filled out. Then when we fill it out, we'll click it and the button is in a loading state. Let's just remove this space. And then in our onSubmit handler, we need to post our form data to an API endpoint. We're going to be using the built-in nextjs API routes. And the way that those work is every file under the pages/API directory will get an associated API endpoint based on the file name. So right here we have this hello.js file, and this is just the default one that came with the Next app. So every file here will get its own endpoint. So if we go to our app/API/hello, it's going to trigger an API request and it'll be handled by this function. And Next.js will take whatever function you export as the default from each file in the API folder, and it'll use that to handle the request. And this function will have access to the request and response objects, which are pretty much identical to the Express.js objects if you ever work with that. And here we could just set a response. So this handler is just returning a 200 with this JSON payload to every request to /API/hello. So if we go back in our browser and we go to /API/hello, we'll see this JSON payload gets returned. So for every endpoint that we want to build, we need to create a file name for it. In our case, we want to post to the contact route. So we'll just rename this to contact. And now we can start building out the contact handler. Before we actually create the handler, let's create a function that will post to the endpoint. So let's create a lib directory. And in here, we'll just create a file called api.js, and this will contain all of our API requests. we'll export a function called send contact form. It'll be async, and it's going to take in some data. And then we're going to call the fetch API, and we want the endpoint to be /API/contact, because that's what we defined as our file name here for our handler. And then as the second parameter, we're going to pass in an options object, and we want to set the method. We'll set it to post. We want to set the body of the request, and we're going to stringify the data that was passed in. So we'll call json.stringify and pass in that data. And then we also want to set the headers. And this is important because when Next.js in the request handlers sees that the header content type is application/JSON, it'll know to automatically parse the body for you. So we won't have to do that on every request. So I'm just going to paste in these headers. And it just basically says that the content type we're sending is JSON, and we accept JSON as the response. So now that we have this, we can go back to our contact form and call this function. Let's import it. And then we want to pass in the values. And remember, these values come from our state, which should have all of our form values. So if we hit save and we go back to our handler, we can log out the request body, and we should be able to see all of our form values. Let's go back to our form and just input some dummy text and then hit submit. And then we'll see in our console here, we'll see this request body, and that was logged in this handler because we made the request to /API/contact, came to the handler, and we have access to the request here. And then we sent back this response. So now let's build out the handler. First, I want to convert this to an arrow function. And in here, as I mentioned before, we have access to the request. In our case, we just want to handle post requests to the /contact route. So let's change this response to be the default error handler. So we could send back a 400, and then we'll also just return a message, and we'll just say bad request. So this will serve as our catch-all error handler. And we could just return this. So now in here, we can check the method of the request and verify that it was a post request. So we'll do if request.method == post. Then we want to handle it. Otherwise, it won't make it in this if block, and then we will eventually send back this 400 response. Once we verified that it was a post request, we want to grab the request body. So we could do const data = request.body, and that'll grab the JSON payload we send. And then we want to run some validation. We can check if any of the properties that we're expecting are defined. So let's just go back to our contact form and copy all of these here. So if any of these conditions are true, if the name or email is undefined, then we'll make it into this block, and we just want to return out the same error response. Okay, so if we get past that check, then we know that all these values were defined. Then we know that we're able to send the contact form because all the fields were filled out. The next thing we need to do is to actually send the email. I'm going to be using NodeMailer to help us do that. And if we look at their documentation, you could see that all we need to do is create a transporter object by calling the createTransport method and passing in some options. And then we just need to call sendMail on the transporter. So that's pretty simple. Let's come back to our app and create the transporter. So in our config folder, we could create a file called NodeMailer. And we're going to create our transporter here and then export it out into any API routes that we need. So we just want to create it in one place as opposed to on the fly on every request. To create the transporter, we could do export const transporter, and we're going to set it equal to nodemailer.createTransport. We need to import NodeMailer from the top. And on the createTransport method, we could pass in an options object. And on here, we could define a ton of properties, but the one we want is the service. And we're going to set that to Gmail because I'll be using a Gmail account, but you could also put Yahoo or iCloud or whatever service you're using. But if you want to follow this tutorial, you're going to need to use Gmail. And then we also need to pass in an auth object. And this object is going to contain the user, which will be the email that we're going to use, and then also a password. I don't want to put in the username and password just in plain text in the code. So instead, we're going to want to use environment variables. And if you pull down the code, you'll see that there's a sample env file. So you're going to want to copy those variables and then at the root directory, create a .env.local file. And Next.js will know that when you're developing locally, it'll use this env.local file to grab all the environment variables in here. But once you're in production, it's not going to use this file. So we can come in here and just define the variables in the sample. For the email, I'm just going to copy mine in. And then for the password, if we go to the NodeMailer docs, you'll see that they have a page on using Gmail. And it says that if you're using two-factor authentication, you have to create an application-specific password for NodeMailer to work. And my Google account does have two-factor authentication, so I'm going to need to create this application-specific password. So I'm going to go to my Google account and click Manage Your Account. And then in here, I'm going to go to Security and then down to App Passwords. So in here, I'm just going to need to enter my password. And then once we're here, we can select an app here, and I'm just going to do Other, and I'll call it NodeMailer, and then I'm going to generate a password. The code here is the password that was generated, and I'm going to delete this right after the video, so it's not going to be useful. But once you have that copied, you just want to paste that in to your environment. And once you hit save, it should restart the server and load the new environment file. So we could just close out of here, and now we can pull in those variables. And then we could use them down here in the auth object. So we'll put email down here, and then password can just say password. I'm also going to want to export a mail options object, and we're going to use that later when we call the send mail method. In here, I just want to define the from and to email, and that's just going to tell NodeMailer from what email we're sending the email from, and then which email we should deliver it to. And in our case, we're just going to use the same email for both, because the way that this is going to work is we're going to be sending ourselves an email, because when the user fills out a form on our website, they're not giving us access to use their email and send an email on their behalf. So instead, we have to use our own email and just send that email to ourselves, and we'll know from the contact data who actually submitted the form. I hope that makes sense. Now that we have these options and the transporter, we could go back in the API route and use it. Let's create a try-catch block. So if the transporter throws any errors, we want to be able to catch those, and we could log the error to the console, and then we'll return an error response. Except for the message, instead of bad request, we want to do error.message. And now in the try block, we want to await the transporter send mail method. Let's call the transporter and import that at the top, and then call send mail. And send mail takes an options object. We want to grab these mail options and spread those in here, import those as well. And then we also want to set the subject, and that'll be equal to the data.subject, whatever the person put in on the form. And then we also need to add the text, which is just going to be a string of the email. And this is what the user will see if their client can't render HTML. So we'll just say this is a test string. And then lastly, we can set the HTML property, and this could be a string of HTML that will actually be rendered in the user's browser. So we could add heading tags and paragraph tags, and we could make it look a bit nicer. So let's just add an H1, and we'll just say test title. And then I'll add a paragraph tag, and we'll just say some body text. And we also need to change this to an async function in order to use the await. And if the sendMail method was successful, we want to return a success response. So if we hit save now and go back to our form, we could put in some dummy data. And once we hit submit, we should see that email being sent. And right now we aren't handling the response from the API, but if you look in the email, for some reason there was an error. Values is not defined. And that's because we need to change this to be data, because that's what we called the body here. And now if we go back and refresh and fill out the form again, it should work. So if we hit submit, it'll load for a second and we should see this email. And there's our H1 and our paragraph tag. And then you could see this is the text string that we put. So in our case, instead of just putting the HTML like this, I want to use a template. If you look at the templates directory and open up this email.html file, you'll see that this is what our contact form is going to look like. And right now it doesn't have any fields or values. It just has this HTML data. And that's because in here, this is going to be the div that holds all of our form data. And I just put in this placeholder value. But in our actual code, we're going to replace HTML data with the actual heading and paragraph tags. So this is just acting as a placeholder. So back in our API route, instead of setting the text in HTML like this, I want to create a function that's going to return these two properties, and then I'm going to spread them in. So let's come to the top and we'll call the function generate email content. And it's going to take in some data, and that's going to be the form data. And in here, again, we need to return those two properties. So let's return an object with text and HTML. And then we're going to fill these out as we build out the function. So the first thing I want to do is build out the text string. And in order to do that, I'm going to take our data object with all the keys and values for the form that was submitted, and I want to put them all into one string. Let's call the variable string data. And it's going to be equal to object.entries, and then we're going to pass in the data. The entries method will take in an object. So I did a little example here with this object, and it returns an array with each item in the array being another array with the key and the value for each property in the object. So at the end, you'll get an array of all the key and value pairs for each property that was in the object. So once we have that, we want to call the reduce method. And this method is going to take a function as a parameter and then also a starting or initial value right here. And in our case, it's going to be an empty string, and that's going to be our container or accumulator value. So we're going to keep appending to this string. By default, it'll just be empty. And then our reducer function gets that accumulator or whatever value we put here as the first parameter. So we could do string. And then the second parameter is the item in that array in data. For the first item, it'll be this array. And then the next iteration, it'll be this array, and it'll keep going down until it gets to the end. So we want to destructure the key and the value of each item. So let's do that. We'll open up the square brackets and do key and value, and that'll get all the values. And then inside the function, whatever we return from here becomes the new accumulator value, which will be returned to the next iteration. Let's take the string, and on the first round, it's just going to be empty. So we're going to want to append. So let's add that plus sign before the equal sign. So we're going to be setting string equal to whatever I add to the right of this equal sign. And I want to append every single key and value. Let's first get the key. I'm going to open up these backticks. And then instead of just putting the key in like this, on the object, it's going to be lowercase, but on the form, I want it to be uppercase. So I'm just going to create a quick little object map that's going to map each property in the form to the name that we want to see on the email. So I'll call it contact message fields. And then for the name property, I want the actual email field to be name. And then all of them are just going to be uppercased. In here, instead of outputting the key on the object, I want to get the key off of this object. So I'll do contact message fields, and then I'm going to pass in the key here. So then for email, it's going to get this value as the key. And then I'll do a colon, and then I'm also going to output the value. And it doesn't like this for some reason. And I need a closing brace there. Okay. I'm also going to want to add some extra space in between each key and value so that it's not all jumbled up into one sentence. So I'm just going to add some returns. And then after each value, I want to return twice to give it some extra spacing. Okay, so for each item, we're going to get the key and the value, and then we're going to take the accumulating string, and we're just going to append the key that is based off of this contact message fields map. So we'll either get name, email, or subject, and then we're going to do a colon and set it equal to the current value of the item in that array. So in the end, the string data is just going to be a long string of all of our keys and values. So for our text, we can return string data here. And now let's create the HTML data. And before we do that, I realized we have to actually return this string because whatever this function returns on each iteration becomes the new value for the following iteration. So if I return this string with the added values, that's what's going to be the string value on the next item. And then it keeps going on till the end. And since this is an arrow function, we don't need these curly brackets because we could just remove the return, and with the arrow function syntax, it'll know to automatically return this string. We can also get rid of this semicolon, and I realized we had an extra bracket here, so we can remove that as well. Now this becomes a lot more concise. Let's create the method for generating the HTML. So we'll do const HTML data. This is going to work in a very similar way, so I'm just going to copy and paste these lines. And instead of returning the key and the value in a string, I want to return some HTML. For each key, I want to return a heading tag. So let's create that. We'll do h1. And then in here, I want to output the key. So we'll do the $sign and the curly brackets. We want to get the key from this object, not the original form data key. And that'll be the content for the h1. And then for styling purposes, I want to add a class name to it. And if you look up here, I defined some classes, so like the form heading, which will just set some CSS properties. And then I also have a class for the form answer, and that's going to be the paragraph tag. Let's go ahead and add those classes to the heading tag. So we'll just say class, and we'll get the form heading. And then I also want to give it an align of left. Now we have our h1. And then the next thing we need to add is our paragraph tag. So let's open that up. And in here, we're going to want to just display the value. And then we also want to paste in a class and the align left, except we're just going to want to change the class name to be form answer. So on each iteration for each key and value pair in that data object, we're going to be appending an h1 tag and a paragraph tag. So at the end, this string will just be a long string of h1 and paragraph tags. Now that we have that, we want to replace this placeholder value that has HTML data with the generated string that we created here. So I went ahead and I just copied the entire file and ran it through an HTML minifier, and that removed all the white space. So I'm just going to paste in that string here, and you can see that it's all just pushed together, but we still have this placeholder value. Since it's in that $sign, we are injecting it in as a variable, and if we go and find it, you'll see that when we click on it, it's equal to this string that contains all of the h1 and the paragraph tags. So we're basically injecting the h1 and paragraph tags into this long string that is basically this HTML file. So in the end, this will contain our keys and values of all the form fields that were sent. Now that we're returning the text in HTML, we need to use this function down here. So we'll remove these properties. And then above the subject, we're just going to spread out the content or the return value of this function. And then we're going to pass in the data as a parameter. So now the transporter is done and it should be able to send mail successfully. Let's go back to the front end and finish this submit handler. Right now, we're just calling send contact form, and we're not doing anything with the response, and we're also not handling any errors if something goes wrong. So let's first open up this function, and I want to paste in some error handling if this API request returns a 400 or 500. So I'm going to tack on a .then, and I'll get the response, and then I'm checking if response.ok is falsy. And in the case of a 4 or 500 status code, then response.ok will be false. And in that case, I want to throw the error with this error message, failed to send message. Otherwise, if it was successful, I'll just return the response.json, and that's basically just going to return the response body parsed. So since we're throwing this error, we can then go back in our submit handler and wrap all of this in a try catch so that we can catch the error that this potentially throws. And then I just want to set the state to include that error that was thrown. So I'll just call this set state. I want to set is loading to false. And then I also want to set the error property, and I'll set that to the error.message. And that's going to be equal to the error message we defined here, because this is the error we're throwing. So now we can come up here and destructure the error from our state. We could do a check below the contact. We could check if error is defined, and if it is, we're going to output some text with this light red color and give it some margin, and then we just want to display the error above the form. So let's manually return an error, and instead of checking if the method is post, I'll just do the opposite of that, so then it's always going to just return this 400. And now, if we go and fill out our form, we should see that error. And there it is. So there, our error handling is working. So now let's undo that, and let's work on the success result. On success, I want to basically reset the form. So I'm going to set the touch state and the form data to the initial state. So the touch will just be an empty object because that's what it was initially. And then I'm setting the form state to the init state, which will just have values equal to this initial starting value. And then lastly, I just want to display a toast for when it's successful. And that's that green pop-up that will come up at the top. To do that, I need to import useToast from Chakra. We'll do const toast equals useToast. And then we can just invoke this toast to make it pop up. So after we've set the state, we'll just invoke it and we'll give it a success status so that it's green. It'll display for 2000 milliseconds. It'll be at the top, and this is the message we want to display. So now if we hit save, we should be able to fill out the form and see the email come in with that template that we used. So now I'll hit submit, and we'll see if it all goes through, and it looks like it did. So if we check our email, we should see that new message, and it's formatted using our template. And here are all the fields that were passed. And now, as the user, since this email came from me, I could just take the email that was passed in the form and then respond to them and reach out to the customer. That's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more content. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers, and I just really appreciate all the support you guys have been showing, so thank you for that, and I'll see you guys in the next one.